Hey y'all, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast, episode 1 of season 1, which I admit is a little presumptuous to say. I don't know that there will be a second season, but that, dear friend, will rely on you hitting that subscribe button wherever you get this podcast. Also, leave a review. That way, I know how many people are digging it, or perhaps more appropriately, how many people are trying not to dig at all. Sorry, I won't do that again. Anyway, the goal of the No-Till Market Garden podcast is to talk no-till market gardening with growers of all sizes who have employed a variety of different no-till methods on their farms on a production scale. I should also say I may talk to some scientists and authors and, about subjects that pertain to no-till gardening, but mostly the goal is to break down and describe the methods fellow no-till growers are using so you may emulate them on your farm. Because we all want to till less, right? We need to. But one thing I hear a lot from nearly every grower interested in no-till methods is that finding the information about how to run a full-blown market garden without tillage, the sort of nuts and bolts of it all, is just challenging. The info is just not readily available. We know how to grow a carrot or a rutabaga. How do we do it without tillage? How do we flip over beds, start gardens, transplant, direct freaking seed something? Those are the questions I'm hoping this podcast will answer. Because in many ways, this is a brand new form of agriculture, y'all. Post-industrialization, we are not going back to farming with sticks and stones. We are creating something new with an entirely new set of resources. We have steel, obviously, and we have the internet. We have engineers, tool designers, scientists, and brilliant growers to help us develop systems that are profitable for the grower and the soil alike. We also have podcasts, so maybe that will help too. So in episode 1, I caught up with Daniel Mays of Frith Farm in Scarborough, Maine. I don't know who turned me on to Daniel's work first, but my word, what an inspiration that farm is. For several years, Daniel has run a 3-acre market garden there at Frith without tillage that relies on a fairly innovative but simple cover cropping strategy, which he generously covers from start to finish here. Yeah, my man. Lots of great ideas in this conversation. Very excited to have him as the first guest, so let's get into it. Here is Daniel Mays from Frith Farm. All right, Daniel Mays, welcome to the No-Till Market Garden Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, man. So maybe just to calibrate us a little bit, can you give me an idea of how big is Frith Farm? Like how much acreage are you working with? What kind of crops you're working with, and maybe how you're marketing and distributing those?
Absolutely. So we have 5 open acres here. We grow about 3 of them in vegetables. The other 2 are pasture for laying hens, meat chickens, meat turkeys. And we sell through CSA. We have an on-farm CSA of 150 members. We also sell at 1 local farmers market and to 4 natural food stores.
Okay, so are all 5 acres, you said 3 are in production and then 2 are out? Is that kind of how it works?
Exactly, yep.
Okay, so, and are all 3 of those, I guess, are those all no-till?
Yep, they're all permanent bed, no-till system, and they've been, most of them have been established now for 8 years. Some a little bit shorter since we've been growing a bit in the beginning.
Nice. So has it been no-till that whole 8 years?
Yeah, I guess except for initially opening the pasture. We did till once to get started and form the beds, but after that, it's been no-till.
Nice. So I do want to talk about that, but first maybe we could discuss a little bit of the history of Frith Farm. Like, did you come from a background of agriculture?
No, not at all. I'm part of the second wave of back to the landers, I guess. My parents were teachers. I guess my closest agricultural family connection was my great-grandfather, who I never met, but I have visited his farm, or what was his farm in England.
Okay. And then, and you also have a background in ecology, right? Like, what did you do when you were growing?
Yeah. So I studied math and physics in college, and then went on to grad school in environmental engineering. And as part of that was sort of studying all these issues of sustainability, and sort of started thinking more about, what what is sustainability and what is sustainable for me in my life, and realized staring at a computer was for 40 hours a week was not sustainable. Um, and I had done some sort of traveling, woofing, volunteering on farms, um, but really I didn't know much at all when I got started. So I helped a couple friends start a little CSA on one of their parents' land in Massachusetts for part of a season, and I loved that so much I left and started looking for land.
So then, who were some of your early sort of no-till inspirations? Like, what guided you in that direction?
Yeah, it's really just through reading books on soil health, and they all say like tillage is so bad for the soil, but we kind of have to do it to you know meet these other goals. And I realized once I formed my beds, um, I just didn't see much reason to keep tilling them after that. So I didn't really have when I started, I didn't really think there was much of a anybody else doing it. So it's been really exciting in the last few years to realize it's kind of popping up all over the country and the globe.
Yeah, I agree. It's funny because a lot of times what I tell people is that, we use tillage because we really weren't aware of another option. Like, we realized that tillage was bad and we tried to reduce it as much as possible. But we weren't really aware beyond using hay mulch, which often added a lot of weed seed and a lot of difficulty, what other options we had. So it's cool to see more of these models like yours popping up.
Yeah, I agree. It's very exciting. I sort of thought of myself as a weirdo farmer in the beginning. Couldn't really relate on a lot of levels to other farmers, even like small organic farmers who were tractor based. So it's nice to feel that I'm not alone out there.
Yeah, sure. So I don't know, maybe take us back to those early years. So you formed the beds using tractor, or did you do all that by hand?
All with a BCS walking tractor, with the rotary plow attachment. So we did the initial tillage, and that attachment is pretty amazing if you are going to be tilling or forming raised beds, because it doesn't like over churn and kind of create that hard pan layer like a rototiller does. It kind of mimics the plow and disc passes all in one, and kind of inverts the sod and chops it up a bit. So yeah, funny to be talking about tillage on a no-till podcast, but yeah, it's a great tool if you are going to till that initial time. So I did that for every single plot, and then marked out where the paths would be, and then you make another 2 passes down the paths to form your raised bed.
And then, so you guys I just saw were getting ready to break open new ground, and you don't have to worry about talking tillage because I feel like hey, I'm just going to jump in here real quick. I go on kind of an incoherent rant, but essentially I say that, this is an anti-dogma zone. So there will be a little tillage in this podcast. There will be, some people who never till. We're just trying to give more options for how to no-till. So, yeah, that's it. Anyway, I'm out anyway, so no-till can be a million different things, in other words. At least that's how I see it. So you guys are getting ready to break open new ground. Take me through that process.
Sure. Yeah. So I do believe in I call it one-time tillage. I've experimented with ways of transitioning from sod to garden beds without tilling, and they certainly can work. But I feel like none of them allows the rate of progress, the rate of transition that single time tillage allows. Plus, that tillage allows you to mix in all sorts of good stuff that first time. Because once without that mixing in capability later, you're stuck kind of relying on the slower processes of biology and plant roots and earthworms and stuff moving things around. So this is a kind of a way to cheat and get a lot mixed in right from the beginning. So you're off to a good start. So yeah, I spread kind of whatever cocktail of good stuff I can get my hands on. whether it's different rock powders based on a soil test. Lime or sulfur, depending on your pH. Try and get your pH dialed in a little bit. And then lots of compost and any kind of organic matter I can get my hands on, as long as it's not too heavy in the carbon spectrum. Like, you wouldn't want to spread a bunch of wood chips and till them in and tie up your nitrogen. But yeah, good finished compost. We spread it kind of as thick as you can go, so that the rotary plow will still hit soil beneath it. So you're not just like turning compost onto itself. So yeah, we'll spread it like a good 4 to 6 inches deep, and then till all that in with the rotary plow and form the raised beds, and then you're kind of off hitting the ground running.
And I should explain for people who don't know that rotary plow, sort of like you described earlier, is it looks like a corkscrew of sorts, and it spins straight downward and throws your dirt off to the right. Or if you have, I guess there's one that's a double that actually throws it both directions, but generally the main rotary plow throws it off to the right. Yeah, we have one too. It's a really, really efficient tool. So you're doing that. You're mowing your pasture, presumably, laying down a bunch of compost, and then going and doing your rotary plowing as you would for opening up any plot.
Exactly. Yeah, we actually graze down the grass with the layers, and they're adding fertility as well. And then spread compost or spread the rock powders first, so you're not walking over the compost to spread those. We spread green sand, granite meal, kelp meal, Minifee humates. I feel like they're diehard fans of each one of these things, so I figure put a little bit of all of it and cover your bases. And then the compost real thick, and then the rotary plow, which is a corkscrew, except without the hollow part in the middle, so it's kind of like a bladed corkscrew. So that and it's slow going. A single pass you only do like 10 inches wide. So it takes, we can do maybe probably at the most in a day, probably 10 or 12,000 square feet. So it's, relative to a tractor scale, it's a very small scale, slower tool, but it does a really great job prepping the soil.
Hey, well, I've got a second here to jump in and just say that if you're enjoying this podcast, consider signing up and being a Patreon. I will put all of that information in the show notes. Back to Daniel. Nice. Okay, so once you have your beds formed, what's the next step?
Yeah, so if there are a lot of perennial grasses and weeds in there, we have quack grass here, sometimes called witchgrass, which is a rhizomatous grass that it's very, very hard to kill. Typically people just till over and over again to kill it. So if we have a lot of those in the beds, we'll actually use some kind of smother, whether it's black plastic that we lay by hand and bury by hand, or we have some tarps that have holes cut in them for transplant spacing. So we'll lay that whole tarp over a plot after the beds are formed, and then plant something like winter squash in there. And that'll...
How big are those tarps?
Yeah, they're big. Let's see, they're probably like 60 by 60 feet.
Wow. Okay, so you're getting your beds and everything tight enough where if you get those all made, you can lay out that tarp and the holes will line up well on your beds?
Exactly. Yep. The key is to cut the holes after it's laid out on your set of beds. Don't try and measure the holes, because since the paths go down deeper than the beds, it's not going to be exactly your on-center spacing of your bed spacing. It's going to be a little bit more. So our beds are 5 feet on center, but the holes between, the distance between holes on the tarps is a little bit more than that, because the tarp's not sitting in a two-dimensional plane. If that makes sense.
Okay, and you are reusing these tarps then?
Yes. Yep. We have a set of them, basically one plot's worth, so 2 giant tarps that we then move around any plot that we're opening up.
Okay, so tarps go down, and like you said, you were talking about winter squash.
Mm-hmm.
You go in with another crop immediately after you put those tarps in.
Yeah, so the tarps go in.
So
Yeah.
Sorry, let me restate that. So you essentially get your beds ready, you put your tarps down. They already have the holes in them, or you burn new holes, presumably if you have to, and then you put your crop in, depending on the time of year. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. And if we're opening up smaller areas, or if you want to plant something with different spacing than those, winter squash spacing, then we do resort to a single use of black plastic sometimes, just for that initial opening of the bed. It's kind of the same rationale as tilling one time. It's a one-time thing to get you transitioned. Because then with the black plastic, you can just cut whatever spacing you need.
And this is not the biodegradable plastic. This is just your regular.
Correct. Yeah. It's the regular disposable, wasteful practice.
Sure. All right, and then now I want to because I'm assuming this is where it goes next, is that we get into cover crop. And this is definitely something I want to focus on with you guys, because I think this is super cool what you guys are doing.
Mm-hmm.
So that black plastic, that crop comes out, presumably those tarps, so that black plastic comes up. And so what's your next step there?
Yeah, so then you have this kind of nice bare soil. It's been smothered for that whole season. The worms and bugs have been active. There's no living growth on it once the squash comes out, or whatever other crop. So yeah, that's soil in its most vulnerable state. Especially once you peel back that cover that was protecting it from rain and wind. You got to get something growing on there, or covering the soil, protecting it as quickly as possible. So if it's super late in the season and there's not time to plant a cover crop, up here in Maine, we go dormant for the winter. You can't really grow. You can't plant things after a certain date; they just won't grow. So if it's too late to plant anything, then we will mulch with leaves. We have a lot of deciduous trees around here, so leaves are a very renewable resource. So we'll mulch thickly with leaves for the winter. But if we do have enough time and it's early enough in the season, which for me is kind of, I think of like early October is kind of the latest I would try and plant a cover crop of rye and clover. Then we'll plant that. And if it's early, kind of early September is the cutoff in my mind for peas and oats. So yeah, ideally we'd get in either peas and oats or rye and clover before it gets too cold and the days get too short.
And then you're planting these with the earthway. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep. So we have 2 earthway seeders, and we put the seed plates on. One for peas, one for oats, or one for rye, one for clover, and we'll have 2 people just walk right after each other, and we'll walk up and down the beds. We do 14 passes in a bed. Again, our beds are 5 feet on center, and that gives a really good germination and a really good stand pretty quickly. So you're not waiting for it to fill in. Since up here in Maine, our season is short. We don't have a lot of leeway in getting things established.
Can you say what plate you're using for each of those? Or, I mean, I guess the peas is probably obvious, but what are you using for like the rye and the...
Yeah, absolutely. And peas, actually, there are 2 pea plates. There's the jumbo pea and the small pea. So we use the small pea plate. That seems to be, good size. The field peas are pretty small. For oats and rye, we use the beet plate. That puts them down, pretty nice and thick. Which is great. And the clover, different clovers are different sizes, but generally the small clover seed will just use the carrot lettuce plate. I think it says carrot lettuce and other small seed.
Okay, so is there a reason the earthway? Like, is there something about it that you like more than other seeders?
Yeah, I guess it's price. First and foremost, it's $90 for a brand new earthway. So I just and it's worked for us from the beginning. So I haven't really tested a lot of other seeders. That said, I am going to get a Jang next year, just so I know what I'm missing out on. And hopefully there are some crops that we end up having to thin, and that that takes a fair amount of time. So I'm hoping the Jang will enable us to skip that step.
Sure. Those crops that you're thinning, are those like carrots and beets and that sort of thing?
Yeah, beets, carrots. I find the Earthway carrot plate actually does a pretty good job. You know, they end up going down pretty thick, but we have nice loose soil, so they end up kind of filling out anyway, and we get really high yields from our carrot beds.
Are you using the light plate or the heavy plate on that one? Because I think there's 2 carrot plates, right?
Are there 2 carrot plates? I don't know. I've only seen one. It's the
There's one with like a little edge on it that grabs more seed, and then there's one that doesn't have an edge. It's just flat.
Interesting. It's
but that's fine.
Yeah, it's one of the 6 original plates that come with the Earthway seeder.
So jumping in here real quick, the original plate was actually the thick one. If you want the light one, you got to buy it. Yep.
I should also say my seeders are like 7 and 8 years old at this point, so maybe they've updated the plates. I don't know, but yeah, I've kind of worn them.
Hey, you gotta love the Earthway for having that sort of longevity.
Yeah, definitely, and it's definitely time to buy new ones because I've worn down. The rubber belt is stretched out, and the furrower, V is ground down by an inch. So yeah, I got to get new ones next year.
All right, so take us to the springtime then. You've got a bed sown to cover crop, and you want to prep it for a cash crop. So what's the next step?
Yeah, so it depends. What we planted the previous year is totally dependent on what is going in that bed the next year. And I have a crop plan that I make, a full year in advance so that I know what's going where, because wherever you plant rye and clover, you're not going to be replanting that bed in the spring. That rye and clover is going to be so established, it's going to take a while to kill in the late spring, early summer. So you would not want to plant that right before the beds where your onions are going, for instance. So yeah, that the crop plan affects our choice of which cover crop goes where. So you kind of have those 2 different scenarios. Peas and oats, have to be planted a little earlier, but then they will winter kill. They'll die back entirely in our climate here in Maine, so that in the spring you have this nice sort of mat of dead peas and oats that you can just rake into the paths, and you're left with a beautiful clean seed bed that you can just direct seed right into. The rye and clover, on the other hand, will overwinter. The right clover, we use crimson clover, and it'll grow back in the spring. It'll be the most beautiful bed on your farm in April and May. It'll just burst up full of green life, and then by the end of May, it'll be 5-6 feet tall. And that's when we will wait for it to start to form seed heads, and then we'll knock it down. We've tried various ways to knock it down, but we'll get it to lay flat, and we'll drag a tarp over it and leave that for a couple weeks at least to make sure it's all dead. And then we'll peel that tarp off and transplant right into that grown in place mulch of straw, of rye straw.
So you have some interesting ways of knocking it down. I've seen a couple things on your Instagram. Do you want to describe how you guys do that?
Sure. Yeah, we I should say this is our first year kind of experimenting with all this, and it went really well, and we're doing a lot more of it next year because it was such a good success. But yeah, based on our trial this year, the most effective way, since we're not actually trying to crimp it, we're just trying to knock it down to lay flat. We just had a board that's the width of the bed, so a 5-foot long board, and kind of tied strings on each end so people could hold it standing up. And we had a person on each end, and they just kind of stepped in unison, every foot or so down the bed, so that board was pushing the rye over and kind of tamping it down. And with a good firm step, that was enough to get it to lay flat for long enough that then we could drag the tarp over. Obviously, you have to drag the tarp in the same direction that you tamped it, so you're not pulling it back up.
Right. Yeah. I'll actually link that in the show notes so people can see that too, because it's pretty neat. Um, is there a reason that you're pushing it down instead of crimping it and instead of mowing it?
Yeah, so I like to leave it intact. Yeah, the reason not to mow it, I feel like, is then you'd be left with sort of stubble that would then kind of poke up the tarp more and potentially even poke holes in your tarp, depending on how thick your tarp is. Um, and yeah, the reason not to crimp it, I guess, crimping it is just is difficult to do effectively. You need a really heavy crimper, a really powerful, force going down in a sharp area to get a good crimp. But there's certainly room for experimentation with that. I think if you got a really effective crimp, then you could skip the tarp step even potentially, and save that time. But for us, we already have these tarps that we use for smothering anyway, and then we can just knock it down quickly and not worry about every last stem having to be crimped. So it made sense for us.
Where are you getting those tarps?
Yeah, so I have a mix of tarps. I started with used billboards. So these kind of giant vinyl billboards that had an advertisement on one side and were black on the other side. But since I started, those have been ruled not approved for organic use, just because they're made out of vinyl. So now I'm using the polyethylene silage tarps.
Okay. And you guys are organically certified.
We are, yes, yep, right from the beginning.
All right. So after the tarps come off, you're just pulling that aside and transplanting into that, or how's that work?
Yeah, we just transplant right through that straw mulch. It's if you get a good stand of Ryan clover, it's pretty impressive when it's knocked down and killed. Like you really can't see the soil through it. So that combined with the allelopathic effect of the rye, which prevents seed germination, means we had very very few weeds. Out of a 6,000 square foot bed, we probably pulled 20 or 30 weeds the whole season.
And I saw your brassicas, and they looked beautiful. You didn't have to cover them or spray or anything. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. We didn't use row cover, and we don't do any spraying, even the organically approved pesticides. Yeah, we did have some cabbage looper, the little white butterfly that lays the green worm. We did have some of that in the cabbage, but it wasn't, enough to really affect the marketability of most of it.
So for the other beds, the ones that you're going to be doing maybe more direct seeding, and you have the pea and oats mix, you're pulling that into the paths, and then you're just seeding into that in the spring or transplanting?
Exactly. Yep. Just rake that right into the paths. It's broken down enough that it breaks right off from its root system, and you can just rake it right into the path pretty easily.
I want to ask you guys about profitability. Is Frith Farm profitable yet, and how long did it take you to get there?
Yes, I would say we're definitely profitable. I'd say it took 3 years. By the third year, it felt like we were going to stay afloat. The first 2 years were definitely just a lot of work. So yeah, by the third year we were profitable, and by now I would say we're very profitable. We on our 3 acres, we bring in about $250,000 worth of revenue just from vegetables, and so yeah, we're able to pack a lot in because we're this kind of human scale, no tractors, very intensive growing.
How big is your crew?
Yeah, we have a seasonal crew of I guess it's about 8 full-time equivalent employees from April through November, and then we go down to just a couple part-time folks in the winter.
Okay, so are you guys doing any sort of winter production, or is it mostly storage crops?
Mostly storage crops. Yeah, we do have a little bit of winter greens, but mostly that's just for us. So yeah, most of our revenue in the winter is from root crops and garlic, onions, shallots, carrots, beets, and all the storage crops.
I saw the storage radishes. Those looked awesome.
Oh yeah, those two.
All right, quick rapid fire round before I let you go. Most essential part of a farm business?
I would say the people, the good, good workers, and a community of happy workers willing to make it all happen.
Favorite farm or farmer right now?
Yeah, I've just learned about Singing Frogs Farm out in California, and I've really enjoyed kind of the overlapping philosophies that we have. Yeah, I'd love to visit their farm one day.
Yeah, ditto. They're definitely a very inspiring farm. Farming book you couldn't live without?
Well, for me, when I started, Elliot Coleman's The Organic Grower was kind of the main book to turn to for this kind of small scale market gardening. So yeah, I'll give a shout out to Elliot. He's in Maine here too, so got some Maine pride there.
Nice. Yeah. His 30th anniversary book just came out through Chelsea Green.
That's right.
And it's got some cool new additions. He's kind of softened out some of the science a little bit, or fleshed that out a little bit rather, and updated the tools a little bit. So that's definitely worth checking out if you are listening and don't have it yet for some crazy reason. Best advice for a young aspiring farmer?
Young aspiring farmer, best advice I think is go for it. Don't hold back. You gotta start somewhere. So just jump in and make mistakes and learn by doing.
Nice. Well, with that, Daniel Mays, thank you so much for coming on here. I really appreciate your time and your knowledge.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for doing this.
All right, you all, that's a wrap on episode 1. If you like Daniel's work, follow Frith Farm on Instagram or Facebook. All the relevant links are in the show notes. Also, subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review. That is huge. And please consider joining our Patreon group. Trying to build a community of no-till growers over there. You get discounts on potential no-till market garden conference. It's like $2 a month. Go check it out. Also, on a solemn note, the farming community lost a giant this week with the passing of Chris Blanchard. Hannah and I just want to send our best to Chris's family. I never met Chris, but the Farmer to Farmer podcast came right at the right time for us and many young farmers, and in many ways, it saved my farm many times over. So here's to you, Chris. Don't sweat it. We'll keep the tractor running. On a final note, if there's anyone you want to hear on the show, email me at farmerjessefrost, all one word, @gmail.com, or tweet me at roughdraftjesse, also all one word. Anyway, finally, remember, no diggity, no drought. Sorry, I'm still working on a catchphrase. We'll get there. Thanks, fam. See you next week.